Alabama is rewriting the rulebook on who gets a second chance. The state's Board of Pardons and Paroles just rolled out a brand new set of guidelines, and it has sparked an absolute firestorm of controversy. So the big question on everyone's mind is this: is this a real attempt to fix a broken system, or is it just a new way to justify keeping more people behind bars? Okay, let's dive right in.
To really get why this is such a huge deal, you have to look at these numbers. And what's so wild about this is the massive disconnect it shows. In 2023, the parole board's own guidelines, the system they were already using, suggested that about 80% of applicants should get parole. But the actual number of people they let out, a jaw-dropping 8%. That was one of the lowest rates in the entire country, and it created this huge paradox that the state just couldn't ignore anymore.
And yeah, that paradox has drawn some really sharp criticism. Attorney Lauren Farino, who's argued a ton of these cases, she didn't mince words. She called the new guidelines fear masquerading as policy. And that quote, it just perfectly captures the heart of this whole debate. Are these new rules based on evidence and rehabilitation, or on something else entirely? So how did we get here? Well, the pressure on the board to make a change had been building for years, and it was coming from all sides. Let's take a look at the timeline that pretty much forced their hand. This timeline really lays it all out. You see, state law says the parole guidelines have to be reviewed every 3 years. The last time that happened was 2020. But by October 2024, lawmakers like Representative Chris England started calling them out publicly, saying, hey, you're about 2 years overdue. The pressure really ramped up in May 2025, when the legislature basically tied the board's funding to them coming up with new guidelines. And what do you know? Just 2 months later, the board voted to adopt the new, much stricter rules we're talking about today. So after all that pressure, what did the board actually come up with? Let's break down exactly what these new rules are. At its core, the big change is a new scoring system. It's supposed to determine if an inmate is a good candidate for parole. The higher your score, the less likely you are to get a recommendation for release. And right here, this is the crucial part. Under the old system, if you scored a 7 or less, you got a recommendation for parole. Simple enough. Now that window has shrunk a lot. You need a score of 5 or less. And they've added this new neutral category for scores of 6 to 8. That basically just gives the board total discretion to say yes or no. The bottom line, it's much, much harder to get a clear recommendation for parole now. So you might be asking, where are all these extra points coming from? Well, the single biggest change is how much weight they now give to the severity of the original offense. The one thing an inmate can never change, no matter how much they've rehabilitated. A high-severity crime used to be 2 points. Now it's 3. And they've added this brand new, very high category that scores 4 points. That's almost enough to take you out of the running for a positive recommendation all on its own. And there are other changes that tighten the screws, too. A violent incident in prison now adds 3 points instead of 2. Certain crimes, like sex offenses, are automatically classified as very high. But it's not all punitive. The new rules do allow inmates to submit pre-recorded videos, so they can finally have a voice in a hearing they can't physically attend. And for the first time, people will get credit for completing college degrees or trade programs. As you can imagine, these changes have been met with a huge wave of skepticism from criminal justice advocates. They argue this new playbook is deeply, deeply flawed. So let's break down their case against it. The number one criticism is that the new system penalizes people for things that are pretty much out of their control. We already talked about the heavy weight on past crimes. But look at this. It also adds points if an inmate doesn't have a job and a place to live already secured. I mean, think about how hard that is to arrange from inside a prison. The rules also penalize for any public opposition, not just from victims, which critics say could double count their impact. And this is a big one. They only consider an inmate's behavior over the last 12 months. And just as important is what these new guidelines ignore. They give zero credit for long-term good behavior. So what if you've been discipline-free for a decade? Doesn't matter. They don't factor in age, even though all the research shows that the risk of reoffending drops like a rock as people get older. And get this, they totally disregard positive risk assessments from the Department of Corrections itself, the very people who see these inmates every single day. Carla Crowder from the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice really drills down on this point. She points out that if you get denied parole and you're told to come back in 5 years, but only the last 12 months of your behavior is going to count, well, what's the incentive to follow the rules for the first 4 years? It's a really powerful argument that these rules could actually backfire and make prisons harder to manage. Okay, so policy debates and scoring systems can feel a little abstract. So let's shift gears and talk about the real-world consequences for the actual people living under these new rules.
I mean, what does all of this actually feel like for someone who has spent decades working towards a second chance, only to feel like the goalposts just got moved at the very last minute?
To get a sense of that, let's look at the story of a man named Thomas. He's been incarcerated for over 30 years. In that entire time, he's had only one single disciplinary citation, and that was way back at the very beginning of his sentence. For decades, he's been a model inmate. So when he came up for parole, his application was just extraordinary. It included 19 separate letters of support, not from family, but from correctional officers and prison staff, the people who know him best. They called him trustworthy and a good man. The institutional parole officer even told Thomas he was personally recommending him for release. And yet, his parole was denied. The board's reasoning? It came down to two things: the severity of his original crime from over 30 years ago, and, quote, negative input from stakeholders, which in his case was just the Attorney General's office. The victim's family didn't even protest. His next chance won't be for another 5 years.
And Thomas's reaction, it just says it all. After doing everything that was asked of him for 3 decades, he said, "This decision made me see that they are never going to let me out." That sentiment just captures this feeling of hopelessness that many people are now facing, a belief that no amount of rehabilitation can ever overcome the past.
So, at the end of the day, we're left right back where we started. Was the old system, with its 80% recommendation rate, really that flawed? Or are these new guidelines just an attempt to make the rules finally match the board's already super low grant rate? Will Alabama's new playbook actually fix the system, or is it just rewriting the rules of what many inmates feel is already a losing game?